And that's where this show, for me, brings something that's very personal, where I get to, in a sense, add my own creative touch to something that never existed before. Because who's putting Calder together with Vanuatu from the Pacific? I mean, it's a total invention, but it works. So I'm Adam Lindemann. I'm the owner and founder of Venus over Manhattan, this gallery, and I'm kind of the curator of this show and this combination. I've been a collector, a writer for many years, and Venus over Manhattan is now in its 12th year, and we've shown many parts of the world, all sorts of different artists, particularly interested in careers that have been recontextualized or are going to emerge and be surprising and interesting and exciting to the art world. I think we're somewhat iconoclastic. We don't do the expected. I've always shied away from things that other people do or other people can do better. So we try to be the best at what we do. So we're somewhat anti-competitive in that we try to do exhibitions and work with artists where we will do a better job than anyone else. And that's kind of the focus of the gallery. It's a iconoclastic perspective of recontextualization and rethinking what's out there at its best. I started my collecting career in the tribal world. I went to school in my Yale days with a great expert in African and Oceanic art. And the first great work of art I ever bought, important work of art I bought from Ambrym, the great French artist, sculptor Ambrym. He was an incredible accumulateur of African and many interesting things, samurai swords and Bakelite radios, but he had a great collection of African art. And the first important piece I ever bought in my life was a fang from Ambrym. And so tribal art has always been interesting to me. And I've collected African and Oceanic, and I've also supported the Metropolitan Museum, and I've been on the Rockefeller Wing Committee for, 20 years or so. So I've been a speaker at Parcours des Mondes in Paris, and I've written about Basquiat and African art, and I'm supposed to be someone who knows something. But I've spent many, many years in the world of both African and Oceanic art. And I'm also very interested, I started with pre-Columbian art. I'm fascinated by the Maya, and I've studied Mayan hieroglyphic writing. And of course, I know the Olmec and the Aztec and everything relating to Central America and that stuff. So I would call myself an amateur in the sense that I've never worked in this field professionally, but I'm someone who's been to most of the major shows and is a great lover of art from other cultures, not our own. I've always been interested in this. There's an old story, which I'm going to tell you, which is that modern art, the advent of modern art, came out of Paris when all of these objects from foreign cultures were discovered by artists like Picasso, Braque, and many, many others. And so the classic story is that African art created Cubism and Pacific art, Oceanic art, created Surrealism. I mean, that's the cliche, but so everyone in the field knows that. But there's some real truth to that. I mean, great collectors of African art were not Picasso, but he had lots of African art. And I mean, if you look at Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and all that Cubist stuff, how was it possible? So the general thinking in modernism is that abstraction of the human form actually comes out of tribal cultures. Now, none of this is true or not true, but there's no doubt that these objects inspired many of those artists in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s. And we know that for a fact. We know that Matisse had a Vanuatu sculpture that he gave to Picasso, and Picasso had in his studio. We know for a fact that Calder, I'm a huge Calder fan because Calder is the French-American artist. He's the artist that came from France to America with all that knowledge and all that revolutionary thinking from Europe, the sensibility of France in the United States. And of course, the Mobile was named by Marcel Duchamp, and he met Miro in Paris, and that changed his whole life. But Calder collected both African and some oceanic art. And so when I've always been interested in this field, and I just lucked into this private collection of Vanuatu sculptures, which had been destined for a museum, but ended up with a well-known dealer in his late 80s who gave me the works and said, "Here, Adam, they're for you, for your show. Do whatever you want." And so this is my second iteration of a Vanuatu Calder show. And people ask me, why did you choose Calder? I don't know if it was David Hammonds who told me, but someone said to me, and it's true, David Hammonds told me that Calder is the European-American artist, and that has always stuck with me. But Calder goes with everything. And I think the people from our world, the contemporary art world, they need a bridge. They're like, what, Venus over Manhattan is suddenly an oceanic art dealer? Like, they don't get it. So I give them Calder to create the bridge. And of course, the Calder Foundation and Sandy Rower know about these interests, and they actually have lent me, for prior shows that I've done at the gallery, they lent me works that were owned by Alexander Calder. They retain certain masks and certain objects that Calder owned, and so we've included them in shows. Now, it's important to note that the works that these artists owned are not particularly important. Contrary to what you might think, a lot of things that artists own, they just love them. Artists are not counting the money. They're inspired by them. And so Calder was inspired by many things from Africa and the Pacific. And so I just put it with Calder so that people had a bridge to see the circles and the curves and the abstraction and the movement. And ultimately, Calder is a very organic artist. Everything has some sort of organic shape. Even when he makes the circus, it's all hand-built, bent, and has all of that, the touch of the hand. And that's what these works, among others from the Pacific, you feel the hand of the artist. Now, these works are very different from our art of the 20th and 21st century. So they are, for the most part, unnamed, and they were for ritual use. So you have to appreciate these are religious objects. These are not objects that were made for the tourist trade. This is sort of the end of a long history of hundreds of years of the people of Vanuatu creating these ceremonies where they carved fern trees into these spirits. I call them spirits of the forest, but these different types of sculptures which were for festivals. And they were never intended to last centuries. So these are all made of a very light wood called fernwood, Vanuatu fernwood. We have the Latin name somewhere in the description. And they're not rare. They're not, it's not ebony. They're not controlled. They don't contain any substances that are part of any international scarcity or exoticism. It's just regular fernwood from Vanuatu. But, and there are many, many of these pieces because they were made for ceremonies, but they're incredibly beautiful, and they were collected in the 50s and 60s by people who recognize their beauty and preserve. Otherwise, they would have just fallen back into the forest after the ceremony and decomposed in the jungle. So these are the real thing, and the first show that I did, I invited one of the top museums to choose the work for their collection. So we've sold to museums, we've sold to many artists who I love and respect. We've sold to some great art collectors, some art dealers, people who are interested in including that European sense of sophistication and history in their collection. Not just the hot moment of the minute, but to place a work like this in your collection, in your life, is to give an appreciation to prior cultures and people who existed before us and without us, to their languages, to their sensibilities, to their abstraction, to their whole cultural world, which has nothing to do with us. So that mix, to me, is a sign of true sophistication and more, I would call it like a horizontal way of seeing the world, where everything in the aesthetic world has its own value and can be considered on its own merits. It's not just about what's the most expensive thing at auction last year. Like, this is not about that. And that's where this show, for me, brings something that's very personal, where I get to, in a sense, add my own creative touch to something never existed before. Because who's putting Calder together with Vanuatu from the Pacific? I mean, it's a total invention, but it works and people love it. And this is the second show we've done. And it's been so successful, both at the Independent Art Fair that we did at Cipriani a couple weeks ago and here in the gallery, that I think I'll do it again. But not with Vanuatu, we'll do it with some other people. One of the most important moments was the first show I ever did 12 years ago, which was called A Rebours. It was based on a 19th century novel by Huysmans. It was a super erudite, sophisticated title for a very dark and mysterious show. People came to the gallery, nobody understood it. And I was so kind of sad that people were like, what's going on here? And then Jed Pearl, who's a very interesting writer and intelligent man, he wrote me a beautiful review. The only person who wrote a review, I was so happy. But memorable moments for me are like when Roberta Smith came out and supported my Peter Saul show in 2015. That was very important. The Jack Goldstein review was amazing. And one good moment was when I did this Westerman show, H.C. Westerman, who's the great American sculptor who's basically been semi-forgotten along the way, except for a few people. And I thought, no one made this Westerman thing work. I'm gonna make it work. And so I created a whole Westerman show, which was very, very successful. And I have to say, the New York Times has been a great supporter of mine, and I appreciate it very much because makes people come, makes people think, and the Westerman show was just amazing, if I say so myself. But I was somewhat upset and subsequently gratified when Germano Chalant himself called on behalf of the Prada Foundation and said, I'm Germano Chalant and I would like the checklist of your Westerman show. And one of the people in the gallery told me that, Germano Chalant wants your show. And I'm like, no way, he can't have my show, forget it, tell him no. But then subsequently, of course, I realized that that's part of what we do here, and so we gave him the checklist and the Prada Foundation did the show. Another tremendous gratifying experience for me is thanks to the painter Peter Saul, who I knew his dealer through his son when I was in the Lycée Français back in my 13, 14, 15 years old. And all these crazy wild paintings I kind of grew up with. And years later, I was able to exhibit the collection, large part of the collection, of a dealer called Alan Frumpkin, a very interesting man, a very eclectic man from Chicago and New York, who was Peter Saul's great supporter. And thanks to that, we had tremendous press, and we ended up working with Peter up until today. So that's been like 8 amazing years. Peter's now 89. We have a show of Peter Saul in the other space. And so from his 81 to his 89, we've worked very intensely with Peter, several museum shows, books, publishing, and that's been another gratifying experience. Not too long ago, this past spring, we did a show for Richard Mayhew. So Richard Mayhew is a amazing, intuitive, spiritual landscape painter who is of both African American and American Indian descent. And I tripped across him, I think because of Richard Prince. There was a little rumor in the art world that Richard Prince was buying Mayhew. And so we began with Mayhew. I did a little foundation show out in Long Island for him. Then I brought him to the gallery and we had a fantastic show. It was so lucky. My team did a lot of the work. I can't take the credit, but it was so lucky that we got such great material and the other space was so beautiful for the works that We had tremendous press, tremendous curatorial attention, and Richard himself got on a plane at 99 and flew to New York to see the show and to welcome his audience and sign autographs and give people hugs and talk about his work and his art and his inspiration and what it's like to be a Shinnecock Indian and a painter who was part of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. His amazing life story. That made me feel really good. Like in the gallery, of course, we want to make things work for people. We want to bring in collectors. We want to place great things. But for Richard, I feel that we were able to do a really special job, and makes me very happy. Well, we're on our way to Frieze Masters in London. We have some incredible works from Robert Colescott. We're bringing some vintage Peter Saul. We have a fabulous painting by Joan Brown, an amazing Calder. So that's our main focus right now, is our trip to London. And then we're looking already to Art Basel Miami. And that's always been a success for us, Miami. Miami's exciting. Too much traffic, but it's always been a big success, and we've done a lot of work on our Miami booth, and Art Basel has been very good to us. So that's kind of the two projects, and then coming up, we have two artists. We have two primary shows, one of them by our Japanese star, Susumu Kumijo, who's a great painter and a fascinating man. And then we have a young painter from Brooklyn-based called Sophie Larimore, who is doing her show in this space. And that'll be exciting. Right after Frieze, we have two new artists, two new shows. And then in November, we have this amazing super surprise curated show by one of the greatest eminence gris in the art world. But you'll have to stay tuned for that. I can't tell you what it is right now.